Professor Justin Clardy's research focuses on normative questions that arise within the context of interpersonal relationships and political theories. He's assistant professor of philosophy at Santa Clara University, and before that had a postdoc at Stanford after receiving his PhD at the University of Arkansas. He has special interest in questions about social justice and emotions such as love, sympathy, compassion, and tenderness. His work has appeared in Hypatia, the Journal of Black Sexuality and Relationships, Analyze, Journal of Gender and Feminist Studies, as well as a number of books to which he has contributed chapters. Justin's forthcoming book, Why It's Okay to Not Be Monogamous, is forthcoming with Routledge in 2023, and he's currently working on an additional project called Love Hates Us. I'm forgetting the subtitle, and it wasn't on this website. Okay.
Yeah, love, Race, and Non-Monogamies in America.
Love, Race, and Non-Monogamies in America, and he is here to present for us a talk entitled Polyamory in Black.
Yes, so it's my hope that this talk will be as good as it can be on such short preparation. Some of you might have, who have been following my work, might be familiar with some of these ideas. This is a version of a talk that I gave for Rice University just a couple of weeks back. So, you know, we'll see how it goes. I'm excited to present some of this work with you all, and thanks for having me. Let me just get my iPad notes here together. Okay. So, as Ellie said, I'm an assistant professor at Santa Clara University, and yes, suffice to say, I'm happy to be here to be able to present this work with you all. So, today's talk comes from a larger manuscript in progress titled Love Hates Us, Love, Race, and Non-Monogamies in America. The larger project seeks to address a series of larger questions that kind of operate in the background of today's talk, and I have them listed here. Some of these questions include how are racialized sexual subjects such as Black people in polyamorous relationships positioned along multiple axes of oppression? What kind of capital, financial, social, political, or cultural is able to be mobilized by non-monogamous relationships among Blacks? How much of racial justice involves the liberation of Black non-monogamists? What are the penalties and privileges that accompany race, gender, and sexuality in polyamorous living and identifying? How are the experiences of pleasure and danger differentiated and mediated not only by race and gender and sexuality, but also by romantic relationality? How, in other words, are differences politicized in non-monogamous relationships? And I want to say a couple of things. Like part of what animates or motivates this talk is my study of the work of Carrie Jenkins, my study of the work of Elizabeth Brake, but also Nathan Rambuchan's work, who has a book titled Fraught Intimacies, Non-Monogamies in the Public Sphere, or non/monogamies is a very technical term. And one thing that really caught me by Rambuchan's work was the way that his usage of this notion of the intimate spectrum allowed us to sort of create comparisons amongst non-monogamies, right? So much in the literature and, you know, even in some of the talks that we've been sort of seeing over the course of the weekend, non-monogamy is juxtaposed to monogamy, right? And I think that's a worthwhile discussion worth pursuing. However, sort of having been at these questions as long as I have, I'm far more interested in sort of now thinking about the intra-relational things, sort of like thinking about what kinds of non-monogamies have an exercise privilege over other non-monogamies, how might their mobility be constrained or not constrained, so on and so forth. So what motivated this project is sort of thinking about non-monogamies amongst non-monogamies, right? So, yeah. This is a bit of a roadmap for today's talk. It can be broken down into roughly 4 sections, and I've listed them here. In the first section, I draw the contours around liberal discourses surrounding marriage, including liberal neutrality, public reasons, and the difference principle. Once I do that, I set these notions aside for a moment. To present a truncated history of marriage in the United States. In that section, I hope to establish the ways that marriage has been enlisted into an anti-Black racist regime, particularly its monogamous condition. In section 3, I return to liberal neutrality, public reason, and the difference principle as a way of showing what some thinkers have said about rejecting or reforming the institution of marriage and how my claim differs slightly. And finally, I briefly discuss 2 objections and replies to my claim that the liberal state should reform its institution of marriage to reflect minimum marriage. So we'll dive right into the first section, which is sort of contouring marriage in the tradition of political liberalism. In liberal thought and sort of thinkers who have been thinking about marriage reform or marriage abolition have a way of sort of returning to Rawls and thinking about these notions that Rawls gives us or introduces, right? The first, and we heard Professor Brake say some things about liberal neutrality and the difference, in public reason yesterday, but I'll reiterate them here. Liberal neutrality requires the state to remain neutral between the various conceptions of flourishing that its citizens have. It cannot hold or appeal to any particular view to justify its laws, policies, or institutions. Public reason, reasons that one could reasonably expect others with differing conceptions of the good, perhaps drawn from different commitments to different moral or religious doctrines, to accept. And then the difference principle, right, which sometimes falls out of liberal analyses of marriage, but the difference principle maintains that inequalities are permissible in the case that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged and the worst off. And so for me, I'm going to try to mobilize the difference principle as part of making some of my case. Okay, so here are some claims that I'm hoping to establish over the next couple of slides. One, bans on plural marriages today are relics of a 19th century view that racialized, stigmatized, and subjugated intimate relationship styles that deviated from monogamy. The next, in upholding a monogamous condition that has been inherited from a legacy of white supremacy, the present form of marriage is integrally and persistently involved in a race-based system of oppression. And then Black polyamorous who desire to be treated as equals under civil marriage are denied an equal right to choose the kinds of intimate relationships that will make their life go best. All right, and this is not in any order, but I just thought it was a nice visual. So we'll dive right into sort of a truncated history of race and non-monogamies in the United States, and this is a truncated history because it is massive. So I'm going to give you guys the bits of it I think that are relevant for today's talk. The completed manuscript will have a more thoroughgoing history, Black history of marriage and monogamy and non-monogamy in America. Okay, so Tara Hunter and Diane Stewart have excellent histories of marriages in their relationship to Black civil rights. So I have two of those works listed here. Tara Hunter's Bound in Wedlock in the upper right hand, and Diane Stewart's Black Women, Black Love, America's War on African-American Marriage. So within these histories, we get a couple things. One, historically, American resistance to plural marriage has been racist and anti-Black. Some Black non-monogamous unions were created by the domestic slave trade. So thinking here about when partners and families would be disrupted as a result of, sending this strong male slave to some other plantation as a way of, accruing capital, right, so on and so forth. But also, even within the same plantation, right, bondswomen and bondsmen were forced to breed with one another as a way of sort of increasing the genetic lottery and sort of reproducing stronger slaves, right? Bondsmen and bondswomen were forced to do this amongst, not just sort of in these nice, neat dyads, right? No, it was just with whomever, or of course at this time with whatever, right? Because slaves do not occupy the standing of person at this time. Whatever they saw fit. Historical archives reveal that some of these Black non-monogamies were consensual, and I have a star here because consensual I think is going to be tricky, right? We've talked a little bit about consent over the course of the weekend, but it's my sort of hesitation around consensual has to do again with thinking about the slave and its standing, whether or not it is the kind of thing that can consent, right? Again, I go into more detail in that in the longer manuscript, and I'm happy to talk some about that in Q&A. We'll see also the American disregard for Black non-monogamies has been well documented, and so I think that will come out over the next couple of slides. Okay, so there's a tendency among contemporary scholars that study Black love and relationships to focus on marriage and marriage-like relationships. This is not a new phenomenon. At the turn of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois, E. Franklin Frazier, Daniel Moynihan believed that legal monogamous Christian marriage was central to racial uplift for Black folks. Around the same time, Anna Julia Cooper's work was actively questioning prevailing logics that required self-abnegation of women in the pursuit of the Western marital ideal. Contemporary scholars are troubled by the fact that marriage rate amongst Black folks have been cut in half from around 61% in the 1960s to about roughly 30% in 2019. Philosophy has passed over the experience of love for racialized folks. This is what prompts Annika Simpson to write the paper, Black Philosophy and Erotic, where she introduces the question, right, is Black love dead? The Western tradition, starting with Plato on through contemporary metaphysical thinkers that tend to have this separate the phenomenon of love from its lived experience, right? Thinking about love as some sort of a priori concept, if you will. But when we do focus on how love takes shape in real life, we learn that racialized experiences are different, and indeed, love is experienced differently across folks at different intersections. Despite their growing numbers and speckling of representation in mainstream media, not a lot is known about polyamory in Black. By polyamory in Black, I mean the belief in or practice of having multiple intimate caring relationships, not excluding relationships of erotic love and sex at the same time, with the knowledge and consent of all parties involved among Black folks, right? Sometimes I use relata and I have sort of like some metaphysical commitments as to why I'm not trying to use person here or human, right? Again, because this is all tethered to the standing of the Black slave. One distinctive feature of polyamory that marks its departure from its more socially accepted counterpart, monogamy, is that polyamorous relationship structures often include more than two people, all of whom consent to these structures. While the language of polyamory came onto the scene in the 1990s, the theory and practice of intentional non-monogamy in the US has been developed since the late 1800s. Writers have remarked on how anti-polygamy sentiments were tied to such controversies such as slavery, women's rights, citizenship, democracy, and the separation between church and state throughout American history. Our present focus, however, requires that we pay keen attention to those non-monogamies that are marked Black. If it can be shown that the monogamous condition on marriage is involved in an anti-Black racist regime, then a companion justification for disestablishing the current institution of marriage emerges, namely that it perpetuates anti-Black racism. The discourse surrounding Blacks and non-monogamies in the 19th and 20th century situates them as antithetical both to whiteness and American society. In the paper Race Treason, The Untold Story of America's Ban on Polygamy, Martha Ertman discusses how the US Supreme Court justified criminalizing plural marriages through the use of racist tropes. In the first landmark case in upholding statutes banning plural marriages, Reynolds v. the United States, the Supreme Court reasoned that plural marriages were, quote, odious among the northern and western nations of Europe, end quote, another open quote, almost exclusively a feature of the life of Asiatic and of African people, end quote. According to Ertman, on this view, quote, polygamy was natural for people of color, but unnatural for white Americans of Northern European descent. When whites engaged in this unnatural practice, anti-polygamists contended, they produced a peculiar race. And this is a direct quote from the Supreme Court opinion. And that's here, we talk about, this is the quote, plural marriages being odious. And this is an image here called Uncle Sam's Troublesome Bedfellows that actually appeared just 1 week after the Reynolds decision was decided. And here you can see sort of you have a Mormon in the bottom left corner of the picture clutching a scroll that says polygamy on it. And you have these other just racialized tropes. You have a couple of Black figures, those presumed to be Native American as well as African American in the bed. And then there's an Irish person in the bed far on the right clutching a bottle of, I don't know, whiskey or something like that, right? And this appeared in one of the more prominent publications of the day. For context, when Reynolds was being decided, the United States was still comprised of largely independent states. The largely Mormon state of Utah was being viewed as committing two separate acts of treason. The first, operating a theocratic government state. The second, betraying the white race by engaging in the racialized practices of polygamy. Throughout the period, polygamous Mormons, a predominantly white church, were routinely portrayed as barbaric, Black, and or Asian to convey messages of chaos, foreignness, and despotism. Right? This point is illustrated by two images, Uncle Sam's Troublesome Bedfellows, which we see here, as well as the Elder's Happy Home, which we see here. In the first image, I'll go back to this slide. In the first image, published just weeks after the Reynolds opinion, America's Uncle Sam's Troublesome Bedfellows, Mormon, Chinese, Native American, and blacks are characterized as, quote, troublesome bedfellows, end quote. And the Mormon figure clutches a paper with polygamy written on it, linking resistance to plural marriage with fears of white racial contamination and denigration. In The Elder's Happy Home, a polygamous Mormon family is depicted rambunctiously. Numerous wives and children scream and fight while their patriarch in the top right does nothing, right? As if the scene was not chaotic enough, paying keen attention to the single black child in the cradle. If you take a look at the cradle, bottom left, I guess, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but here, right, there's a single black child amidst all of this. Completes the suggestion that polygamy blackens the entire scene and creates a situation where white domestic ordering gets replaced by inexplicable miscegenation and chaos. The black child's presence points at the ways that visibility aligns with hypervisibility, right? An oppressed racial subject, the child's humanity, as an oppressed racial subject, the child's humanity gets obscured and ignored, while the child's presence is simultaneously difficult to ignore to a racially perceiving subject. Mormon passage into whiteness must first pass through monogamy. So the previous slides show how U.S. resistance to monogamy symbolically took shape by mobilizing anti-blackness, and this is in the late 1800s, like around 1880s, 1890s. For example, Reynolds was decided in 1879. The Civil War was decided in 1865, and Reconstruction lasts till about 1877. Utah joins the United States around 1896, right? So this passage comes from Diane Stewart's Black Women, Black Love, America's War on African-American Marriage. And it sort of speaks to some of the shapes that black families took on in the antebellum South. I'll read the quote. This comes from Laura's husband. Please get married as long as I am married. It was never our wishes to be separated from each other, and it was never our fault. The woman is not born that feels as near to me as you do. You feel this day like myself, Laura. I think of you and my children every day. Laura, I do love you the same. My love to you hath never failed. Laura, truly, I've got another wife, and I am very sorry that I am. You feels and seems to me as much of my loving wife as you ever did, right? And what I take to be at play here is a couple of things. One, there's a term introduced by Elizabeth Sheff called polyaffectivity. This idea that you can sort of have simultaneous affections for more than one relata at a time, right? We see this existing in the antebellum South, right? And it does, in some sense, I'm not committed to this, show some extent to which these non-monogamies among black folks were chosen, right? And again, this is going to be a contentious kind of claim, right? We have the forced separation, and then we have Laura's husband taking on another wife, which we don't know a whole lot about. My assumption is that that was some choice because of the way that the husband here is trying to speak to sort of like this, what I'm borrowing from Sheff as polyaffectivity. A bit of context, where Laura's husband is writing to her from, he's actually requesting that, so Laura and the husband have children, and he's writing her and requesting that she send locks of their children's hair to him so that he can extend sort of spiritualistic protection over his children. This is important because, as we know, there have been tropes that emerge in sort of contemporary present-day America that surround the absent black father, right? Here in the antebellum South, right, we have a certain kind of absence brought about via the slave trade, but absence in sort of physical presence needn't sort of imply an absence in sort of spirituality or sort of any sort of like protective force over one's children, right? So just a way of kind of showing the kinds of things that blacks at the time mobilized as a way of trying to demonstrate presence in their families' lives, right? For black folks, assimilation into the national body was also facilitated by monogamy and by monogamous marriage. Aside from being linked with racist, anti-polygamous imagery, some black folks were forced into non-monogamous relationship structures as a consequence of the domestic slave trade or for the purposes of increasing the plantation slave holdings. And some others chose to exist in non-monogamous relationships of their own choosing. Hence, a variety of non-monogamies existed in the immediate years following the Civil War. Consider the passage from Diane Stewart about these prickly scenarios. Quote, unexpected love triangles and other prickly scenarios presented themselves in the immediate post-war years for many. In some instances, Black women resolved such surprises by choosing to remain married to the same man, not necessarily as co-wives, but as co-mothers. After months of making her way from Alabama to South Carolina to be reunited with her husband and some of her children lost to her through the domestic slave trade, Dorcas Cooper was satisfied to remain in a polygamous relationship when she recognized how well her husband's new wife had taken care of her children. Cooper, in fact, quote, liked her husband's second wife, Jenny, and, quote, would not let anybody say anything against her. The two women resided comfortably in the same house with their spouse until Cooper passed away. Thus, some marriages deviated from monogamous customs and included plural marriages, and as Tara Hunter notes, a variety of alternative courtships and marital arrangements. Despite the role that the institution of slavery played in designing intricate polygamous unions among Black folks in America, historical record shows the Freedmen's Bureau agents extending little regard for these relationships. Bureau agents believed that any arrangement that deviated from monogamy contaminated marriage while positioning Black women and children to become dependents on the state, right, these wards of the state. A rationale reflected in Ronald Reagan's 1976 presidential campaign, which cast Black women as welfare queens. As one agent recounted, one Freedmen's Bureau agent recounts, quote, whenever a Negro appears before me with 2 or 3 wives who have equal claim upon him, I marry him to the woman who has the greatest number of helpless children who would otherwise become a charge on the Bureau, end quote. Other legislative barriers and penalties were raised for Black non-monogamists as well. In Georgia, the act to prescribe and regulate the relation of husband and wives between persons of color instructed Black folks with 2 or more spouses to select only one to marry. Immediately after the passage of this act by the General Assembly, if such a man thus living with more than one woman, or such woman living with more than one man, shall fail or refuse to comply with the provisions of this section, he or she shall be prosecuted for the offense of fornication or adultery, or fornication and adultery, and punished accordingly, end quote. The blatant disregard of these Black polygamous unions, as Black historians explain, create vast material disparities, for example, in their capacity to build wealth or sustain families. In my view, it is reasonable to believe that the anti-polygamist and racist climates of the 19th century created a hotbed for attitudes and policies which are resistant to non-monogamies that are rooted in anti-Black racism. American histories catalog how marriage has propped up privileges for those presumed monogamous that depend on the subjugation of non-monogamies. History braids monogamy and monogamous relationships with whiteness and white supremacy. The racialization of anti-polygamous sentiment requires us to ask whether marriage's monogamous condition continues to support white supremacist value. An important note here, right? I should say that the Supreme Court has not revisited cases that ask the question around plural marriage since this very same time period, right? The early 1900s, right? Now, recent arguments making a strong incompatibility claim, namely that liberalism is incompatible with the institution of marriage, come from thinkers like Clara Chambers and Tamara Metz, respectively. For each of them, the institution of marriage violates political liberalism though their rationales have subtle differences. For Metz, marriage ought to be resisted on the grounds that it is a comprehensive social institution. As such, marriage makes a value judgment that liberal society should not make, particularly that an amorous, dyadic, monogamous marital relationship makes for lives that are better off than ones without it. Preserving the legal category of married thus confers an ethical status to marital relationships, and the liberal state, Metz argues, should not be doing this. Therefore, legal marriage should be abolished. On this view, marriage can be likened to practices that reflect commitments that are culturally comprehensive, such as sweet sixteens or quinceañeras. The respective practices are cultural celebrations that ceremoniously mark a coming of age for teenagers in their respective traditions. If the state were to confer special privileges and advantage on these practices, it would reflect particular political commitments and thus depart from the position of neutrality. Therefore, liberal societies have reasons to resist such conferral. Marriage is engaged in this problematic conferral process, Claire Chambers argues, because it includes the acquisition of a specific legal status, i.e. married, and a bundle of legal rights and privileges contained therein. Parties to a legal marriage in America acquire tax and inheritance rights, rights to financial support, more affordable access to health care, hospital and prison visitation rights, entitlements to immigration and eligibility, next of kinship rights, yada, 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 just to name a few. For Chambers, bundling holistic statuses such as married involves the state making judgments about better or worse ways to live. And it marks out one relationship as the most fundamental. It falsely assumes that all the most important needs in one's life are met within the marital relationship. Therefore, the institution of marriage should be abolished. These arguments turn on the fact that marriage violates liberal neutrality because it involves the state in ways that express positive value judgment on marital relationships that are unwarranted. Critics have questioned whether marriage's bundling involves the state in this way. It could be that marriage doesn't assume that the most important needs in one's life are met within the marital relationship. After all, the state makes rights and privileges to say child rearing and property owning attainable to citizens throughout the other avenues as well. Marriage, they claim, is just one route to attaining these rights and duties among others. Further, critics point out that it might be more efficient for the state to provide rights and duties for these relationships because many people will have their needs fulfilled within them. As such, marriage's bundle of rights and duties can be seen as primarily responding to the trend of having one's needs fulfilled in these relationships as a result, instead of like creating it. The thought here is that the justification for bundling rights and privileges in terms of efficiency does not express or appeal to a particular conception of the good. It merely responds to a contingent sociological fact about the ways that individuals order their lives. Even if this is true, that rights and privileges addressing some of our life's most important needs are provided outside of marriage, there are some that are not, i.e. immigration rights. The ones that are outside of the institution of marriage can also be more cumbersome to access. The state's commitment to conferring bundles of rights through marriage can still be questioned on this basis, especially if, as it turns out, there's nothing particularly distinctive about the relationships that it protects, i.e. these mononormative relationships. Why not leave all citizens to access these bundles outside of marriage? Why not extend the rights and privileges that are typically reserved for spouses in a marriage to all Americans? Or at least to all amorous, caring relationships? What about the amorous monogamous dyad is special, in other words, right? What about the thought that marriage's bundle of rights and duties responds to the trend of having one's needs fulfilled within marital relationships? First, critics fail to tend to the growing numbers of people engaging with polyamory and other consensual non-monogamies. Even if the marital institution is compatible with liberalism, it is far from clear that its compatibility exists in its present form. If it is simply responding to the ways that people's amorous relationships trend in the United States, its dyadic condition should be revisited, right? There's a growing exposure to and acceptance of non-monogamies in America. There's another deep question about whether efficiency is the right appeal for American marriage, right? Brake has argued that marriage generates normative pressures that shape people's choices for which amorous relationships they choose for themselves. If Brake is right, and I think that she is, then marriage might be causing rather than responding to these relationship trends. So there's like a chicken or egg kind of problem here, right? Simply to say that. I find rationales in favor of the strong incompatibility claim of deep intrigue. However, I do think that rationales can be offered that uphold marriage's compatibility with liberalism, such as Simon Cabela's-Mays, who offers a compelling proposal where marriage protects relationships of what they call presumptive permanence. And I can sort of revisit that in the Q&A section. But the idea is that marriage relationships are presumed to be permanent, and appealing to the presumed permanence of these relationships it provides a public reason that is liberally neutral, right? Now, on the other hand, we have Brake's work, which argues that marriage is unduly discriminatory, right? Brake's work on mononormative discrimination says that mononormativity involves the false assumption that monogamous, romantic, and usually heterosexual relationships that lead to marriage are the ideal form of intimate relationship and a universal goal for all people. Brake stresses the extent that other forms of caring relationships are indeed valuable and can function in the way that are thought typical of romantic relationships that marriage protects. For example, the caring that takes place between friends bears strong resemblances to the caring that takes place between romantic lovers. From this, she argues that treating a mononormative relationship as a special site of value generates a particularly pernicious kind of unjustified discrimination. The harm of a mononormative discrimination is borne by polyamorous, and more specifically, Black polyamorous in inimitable ways. In the next section, I go into more detail about how the monogamous restriction on marriage upholds anti-Black racism in the American society. For now, though, suffice it to say that polyamorous relationships or intimate caring relationships, not excluding love and sex with more than one person at a time, lack the same kinds of social and political recognitions that their monogamous counterparts have. In my view, bans on plural marriages today are relics of the 19th century view that racialized, stigmatized, and subjugated intimate relationship styles that deviated from monogamy. Straightforwardly, despite the power that the United States Supreme Court has to expand its definition of marriage to include multiple persons without acting unconstitutionally, it has not tried a case on plural marriage since the 19th century. What of the unrecognized and dismissed descendants of Black plural marriages and family arrangements that slavery destroyed? What obligations, if any, does the state have to Black polyamorists? It is remarkable, perhaps, and this is kind of like not so remarkable, that the growing tolerance of sexual minorities that led many Americans to reject the view that marriage has to be between a man and a woman has not yet led to a majority view that people should be allowed to marry more than one person at a time. In A Defense of Plural Marriage, Ronald J. Otter posits that in the minds of many Americans, a numerical limitation differs significantly from one based on sexual orientation and is much easier to defend. Despite what he calls a checkered past, including the subordination of Black non-monogamies and Black monogamies as well, prohibitions on interracial marriages, the subordination of women, intimate partner violence, child abuse and neglect, or other sociopathic behaviors within different same-sex monogamous relationships. There are few contemporary scholars who maintain that we should reform traditional marriage or that it should be abolished altogether. When a legal system in a liberal society does not make room for plural marriage, it compromises the liberty of those who are denied the option of marrying the persons of their choice. Harm is thereby issued at the hand of the state. Particularly, Black polyamorous and other non-monogamies may not be able to have as good of a life as they could have had or achieve their most important ends. In addition to the indictments against marriage mentioned earlier, in failing to recognize plural marriages, the institution also violates the principle of liberal equality, or the difference principle. In upholding a monogamous condition that has been inherited from a legacy of white supremacy, the present form of marriage is integrally and persistently involved in race-based systems of oppression. Black polyamorous who desire to be treated as equals under civil marriage are denied an equal right to choose the kinds of intimate relationships that will make their life go best. In their prohibition, the state acts as an ethical authority that marginalizes their intimate relationships and in doing so diminishes their lives. In asking for the right to marry plurally, polyamorists are asking that the state treat their marital relationships or the marital relationships they want to form equally. They are also requesting that the state treat their liberty to be the own judge of who their partners are going to be, perhaps for the rest of their lives, right? I should have hit the next slide. One little blurb about this image. This image comes from the show, HBO show Trigonometry. And oftentimes people are saying, well, oh, there's not much polyamorous representation on TV. And even amongst that representation, there are no Black polyamories. Or have you seen She's Gotta Have It by Spike Lee, right? Yeah, these are all good, right? These are all good. But this show, Trigonometry, features these three characters primarily who form a triad over the course of the season. It's only been one season. I do recommend it. It's a pretty good show. Yeah, it gives us some stuff worth thinking about. There are also other forms of media that I think portray Black non-monogamies in ways that are, somewhat satisfying. I have criticism for everything, but yeah, I can talk more about those as well. Okay. How are we doing on time?
Sorry, let me calculate. You've been going for 30 minutes.
Okay, so I'll kind of speed through the rest of this stuff because I do think a lot of this will come out in a more organic Q&A. So let me just see kind of like where do I want to go from here. Okay, great. Okay. Now, one might object that the state does not prohibit the formation of or existence of Black polyamorous relationships in its territories. It is not illegal to be or practice polyamory in the United States, they might say. However, this objection misses the point. The point is that restricting legal recognition to monogamous intimate relationships forestalls the possibility for these relationships to be marital. Polyamorists could not become polygamists if they wanted to. Thus, this introduces undue burdens on Black polyamorists that are not borne by their white or monogamous counterparts. For Black polyamorous relationships to exist and simultaneously be denied legal recognition by the institution of marriage is to relegate these intimate, caring relationships to a realm of public, social, cultural, and political invisibility. It creates patterned opportunities for misrecognition to occur, for example, when Black polyamorous men are stereotyped as players. Some of you are familiar with my work on that. And Black polyamorous women as hoes or side chicks. To be clear, my claim that marriage's monogamous condition is involved in a racialization regime is not to say that these denials are unique to race. White polyamorists also cannot marry as such. Instead, it is to say, following Annika Simpson and Paul Taylor, that the racialization regimes tend to mobilize these denials in particular and distinctive ways, and indeed ways that have been studied exhaustively in critical race theory. Simpson and Taylor explain that racialized invisibility takes on at least 4 forms in this paper, this 2021 paper that they have called Marital Shade. I'm not going to go through each of those forms for the sake of time. You guys are just going to have to trust me on that. But the idea is that marriage casts a regulatory shadow on all subjects of a particular society. And I guess a version of my claim is, yeah, if that is true, right, the shade is the darkest where Black polyamorists stand, right? Okay. One might say, well, insofar as marriage is involved in upholding a racist regime, the liberal society is better off without an institution of marriage altogether. Keeping the institution of marriage leaves a relic of its racist history behind, and we are therefore better off eliminating it. This logic resembles the logic employed by racial eliminativists, who advance that insofar as race is a social construct and a progenitor of particularly pernicious forms of inequality and race-based oppression, we are better off without it. Don't we owe it to non-monogamists, and particularly Black non-monogamists, to eliminate the institution? I maintain that the discrimination and oppression that Black polyamorists face is not merely historical, but is ongoing. As the American society is both mononormative and mononormative, marriage and marriage-like relationships are highly valued symbols of status and social and political power. Plural marriage is still a crime in the United States in 2022. This means that the material inequalities Black polyamorists experience are present and persistent. I favor a view of minimal marriage that sees it as a part of a reparative scheme for righting the wrongs incurred by Black polyamorists. In other words, minimal marriage would in part work to rectify past state discrimination, both symbolically and materially. Thus, I am inclined to understand minimal marriage as a project engaged in building a better social order, one where the cost of building a more equitable world should be distributed more on those who have inherited the moral and political liabilities of the past and ongoing injustices. I have serious worries that abolishing the institution of marriage in a moment's notice leaves Black polyamorists out to dry. Reforming American marriage to reflect minimal marriage issues a public apology and enlists marriage in a scheme of reparations due to Black folks, but Black polyamorists specifically. The other objection that I include here, again, a version of this objection was mentioned by Professor Brake yesterday. One might point out that polyamorists are reluctant to seek legal changes. So the question about extending marriage rights to polyamorists as such turns on whether or not polyamorists even desire legal protections at all, let alone the ones that marriage provides. They might also point out that a language and agenda that centralize the importance of rights for polyamorists might comprise the potentiality for polyamory to occupy a more radical queer subject position, and thereby it is less radical. It's a less radical transformative politic, right? In some places, polyamorists have spoken up about the importance of securing political protections around employment and employment harassment and discrimination. In 1996, a survey with more than 200 respondents showed 68% of polyamorists favored civil marriage, with 32% opposing it. Furthermore, the recent shifts in local governments of Somerville and Cambridge, Massachusetts, respectively, which both have sort of recently in 2020 and 2021 extended their institution of marriage to just non-dyadic unions. Reflect an increased and expressed desire for the protections that civil marriage offers. In 2021, 3 polyamorous men in California fought and won to have their polyamorous relationship recognized by having all of their names included on their child's birth certificate. This shows that the political landscape among polyamorous is diverse, and it reveals that polyamorous are not at current a monolith. The class of polyamorous, the class of polyamorous does not universally desire marriage protection poses no challenge to the push toward minimal marriage any more than the fact that not all monogamists desire to marry does. It instead meets the requirements of liberalism to extend equal opportunity for accessing the institution and its bundle of rights and privileges to those polyamorous who do desire those legal protections that marriage affords. The objection might be modified to say that it's not strictly speaking prohibited for polyamorous to marry, right? The objector might point out that strictly speaking, some polyamorous are married dyadically while having other relationships that exist outside of the marriage with the knowledge and consent of everyone involved, right? So like these polyamorous relationships where at least 2 of the partners are married to one another. Marriage, so the story goes, in the minds of these folks, can be anything you make or want it to be, right? This is ridiculous. This objection, however, misses how, when this happens, acute asymmetries are created within polyamorous relationships as a result. For examples, parties to the marital dyad would have different rights and privileges than those who are not involved in legal marriage. This circumstance might well breed a culture of exploitation on behalf of the marital dyad in the direction of those partners who are not protected by marriage in the same way. And this is an outcome that I believe should be avoided. In conclusion, I've tried to argue very quickly that while objections to American marriage that are rooted in liberal neutrality and public reason go some way in showing the need for marriage to be reformed, there are other objections to be found by considering the institution's involvement in a racist regime. And restricting the bundle of rights associated with marriage to those intimate relationships that are presumed to be monogamous, marriage picks out a particular kind of intimate relationship to preserve at the expense of other valuable relationship types, right? Preaching to the choir. It was shown how state and cultural resistance to non-monogamy in America was tied to racist tropes that framed non-monogamy amongst Black folks as threatening to both whiteness and the liberal state. As such, the present state of American marriage violates the principle of liberal equality and the difference principle. In other words, the destruction of, and in other cases, the preclusion of the formation of Black non-monogamies has created material differences in capital, power, and resources that the state owes it to Black non-monogamists to rectify. One way that the state can meet this obligation is by reforming its institution of marriage to reflect the terms of minimal marriage, as this is the most comprehensive set of rights and restrictions that the institution can preserve without compromising liberal values.